Millionaire saves woman from thieves, then learns she's his old classmate. The sound of the city hummed through the air as Alexander King exited the towering glass building that bore his name. His sharp navy suit and polished shoes reflected his wealth and power, but his face showed little emotion. To those passing by, he looked like a man who had it all: fame, fortune, and success, but to Alexander, it was just another day. As his driver pulled the sleek black car to the curb, Alexander waved him off. "I'll walk," he said. The man hesitated but nodded, driving off into the busy streets. Alexander needed time to clear his head. Deals worth millions were waiting to be signed, investors to impress, and meetings to attend, but none of it felt fulfilling. Walking gave him the rare chance to feel like a regular person, even if just for a moment. A few blocks away, Emily Carter clutched her worn leather bag tightly as she hurried down the sidewalk. Her long day at the diner had left her exhausted, but her shift wasn't the real weight on her shoulders. Bills piled up at home, and her mother's medical expenses were growing by the day. She adjusted her red blouse, glancing nervously around. Payday wasn't until next week, and the little cash she had was barely enough to cover groceries. As she turned the corner into a quieter street, her heart sank. 3 men loitered near the alleyway, their eyes immediately locking onto her. She quickened her pace, but her fear must have been visible. One of the men stepped into her path, his face twisted into a mocking grin. "Hey there's." "In a hurry?" he asked, his tone laced with malice. Emily's grip on her bag tightened. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Well, that's too bad," another man said, circling behind her. "How about you hand over the bag, and we'll call it even?" Emily shook her head, backing away. "Please, I don't have anything of value." The leader of the group chuckled darkly. "We'll be the judge of that." Just as one of the men reached for her bag, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "I believe she said no." All eyes turned to see Alexander standing a few feet away, his sharp gaze locked on the group. Despite his composed demeanor, there was an edge to his voice that made the men pause. "Who the hell are you?" one of them sneered. Alexander stepped closer, his broad shoulders and confident stance making him seem larger than life. "Just someone who doesn't tolerate cowards preying on women. Now leave her alone." The leader scoffed but hesitated, clearly sizing up Alexander. "You don't know who you're messing with." "And you don't know who you're messing with," Alexander shot back, his voice like steel. "Walk away now, and I won't have to get the police involved." The man cursed under his breath, glancing at his companions. The sight of a well-dressed, confident man clearly unnerved them. After a tense moment, the group finally backed off, muttering insults as they disappeared into the shadows. Emily let out a shaky breath, her fingers still clenched around her bag. Alexander turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "Yes, thank you." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't," her voice faltered. Alexander studied her, noticing the weariness in her eyes and the faint traces of fear that lingered. "It's all right. You're safe now." For a moment, they stood in silence, the city noise fading into the background. Emily's heart still pounded, but gratitude filled her chest. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier this time. "I don't know how to repay you." Alexander gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't need to. Just be careful." Emily nodded, clutching her bag tightly. "I will." As she turned to leave, Alexander's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. He shook his head, brushing the thought aside, and walked in the opposite direction. But the memory nagged at him. The next morning, Alexander sat in his corner office, the view of the city stretching out before him. He should have been focused on the documents spread across his desk, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman he had helped. Her face, her voice, they stirred something in him, a memory that felt just out of reach. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Who was she?" he muttered to himself. His assistant, Laura, stepped into the room, holding a tablet. "Sir, the board meeting is in 20 minutes. Alexander nodded absent-mindedly. "Laura, do me a favor." Look into the security footage from the corner of Pine and 5th last night around 8. Laura raised an eyebrow. May I ask why? Alexander hesitated. Just something personal. She nodded, not pressing further. I'll see what I can do. Meanwhile, Emily returned to her small apartment, still shaken from the encounter. She placed her bag on the counter and sank into the worn-out couch. The relief of being home was fleeting. Her mother's medication bottles lined the kitchen counter, and the stack of overdue bills stared back at her from the coffee table. Her mind replayed the events of the night before. The man who had saved her, there was something about him, a familiarity she couldn't pinpoint. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. Whoever he was, she was grateful. That was all that mattered. Later that day, Alexander received an email from Laura with an attachment, a screenshot of the security footage. He opened it and immediately recognized the woman's face. The image brought a rush of memories flooding back. High school hallways, a younger version of himself walking past a girl with the same determined eyes and quiet presence. Emily Carter. He said aloud, the name forming on his lips like a revelation. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He remembered her now, a quiet girl who always sat near the back of the classroom, sketching in her notebook. They had never been close, their lives barely intersecting. But now, years later, fate had brought them back together. Alexander's curiosity grew. He wanted to know more about her, about the life she had lived since those distant days. And, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, he felt a pull, a need to help her, just as he had the night before. The memory of Emily lingered in Alexander's mind for the rest of the day. His work became a blur of meetings and phone calls, but every free moment found him staring at the screenshot of her face on his phone. It was strange. He hadn't thought about high school in years, let alone someone like Emily Carter. Back then, he was too focused on his ambition to notice much else. Yet now, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander made a decision. He opened his laptop and typed her name into a search engine. It didn't take long to find her social media accounts. Her profile was sparse, with only a few photos, most of them of her at a diner where she worked, smiling with coworkers. There was no sign of family, no indication of a lavish lifestyle. If anything, her life seemed modest, even struggling. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Why had fate brought them together again, after all these years? And more importantly, why couldn't he shake the feeling that he owed her something? The next morning, Alexander found himself standing outside the diner where Emily worked. He had barely slept, his thoughts consumed by the memory of her quiet strength during the mugging and the faint glimmer of recognition in her eyes. He wasn't entirely sure why he was there, but something compelled him to see her again. Through the large windows, he spotted her bustling between tables, balancing plates with practiced ease. She wore the same red blouse as the night before, and though her smile never faltered, Alexander could see the weariness in her posture. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, the small bell above jingling softly. Emily looked up, her eyes widening slightly as they landed on him. She froze for a split second before composing herself and walking over. "You," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Alexander smiled, his hands in his pockets. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. After last night?" Emily's expression softened, though there was a flicker of wariness in her eyes. "I'm fine. Thanks to you." "Good," he said, nodding. "I'm glad." There was an awkward pause, and Emily glanced around, suddenly conscious of the curious stares from her coworkers. "Do you need a table?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Actually," Alexander said, "I was hoping we could talk. Do you have a break coming up?" Emily hesitated, clearly caught off guard. She didn't know what to make of the well-dressed man who had saved her and now stood in her workplace, asking to talk. But there was something sincere in his expression that made her nod. "Give me 10 minutes?" Alexander watched as she disappeared into the kitchen, then took a seat near the window. The diner was cozy, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. It wasn't the kind of place he frequented, but he found it oddly comforting. When Emily returned, she had shed her apron and carried 2 cups of coffee. She slid into the booth across from him, setting one cup in front of him. "I figured you could use this," she said, her voice still cautious. "Thank you," Alexander said, taking a sip. "I appreciate it." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the diner filling the space between them. Finally, Alexander spoke. "I have to ask, did we go to high school together?" Emily blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "High school?" "Yes," Alexander said, leaning forward slightly. "I think I remember you. You were in my grade, right? Emily Carter?" Her eyes widened slightly, and she gave a small nod. "That's me. I thought you looked familiar, but I wasn't sure." Alexander chuckled, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "It's been a long time." Emily studied him, her expression unreadable. "Alexander King," she said softly, as if testing the name. "You were the guy who everyone thought was going to change the world." He raised an eyebrow. "And did I?" Emily shrugged, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I wouldn't know. I stopped keeping track after graduation." Her words were casual, but there was something in her tone that made Alexander pause. He had always been laser-focused on his goals, climbing the ladder of success without looking back. Now, sitting across from someone who had known him before all of that, he felt an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. "What about you?" he asked. "What have you been up to?" Emily hesitated, glancing down at her coffee. "Nothing as glamorous as you, I'm sure. I work here mostly, trying to keep things together." Alexander frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Life hasn't exactly been easy. My mom's been sick for a while, and the bills keep piling up. But I manage. I always do." Her honesty caught Alexander off guard. He wasn't used to people being so open about their struggles, especially with him. Most people tried to impress him, to prove something. But Emily, she was different. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said sincerely. "If there's anything I can do to help." "I don't need your charity," Emily cut in, her tone sharp. She immediately softened, looking apologetic. "Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. I'm used to handling things on my own." Alexander nodded, understanding. "I get it. But it's not charity. Sometimes we all need a little help." Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something unspoken between them. She didn't know why he was here, why he cared so much, but she couldn't deny the strange comfort his presence brought. "Well," she said, breaking the silence, "thank you for last night. And for the coffee." "You're welcome," Alexander said, smiling. "And thank you for remembering me." Emily smirked. Hard to forget someone who wore a suit to class presentations. He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Fair enough." As she stood to leave, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "If you ever need anything," he said, holding it out, "don't hesitate to call." Emily hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against his. "Thanks," she said quietly, tucking it into her pocket. As she walked away, Alexander watched her go, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. He hadn't planned on reconnecting with someone from his past, but now that he had, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed again for a reason. Later that evening, Emily sat on her couch, staring at the card in her hand. The name Alexander King was printed in elegant letters, along with a phone number and email address. She turned it over, tracing the edges thoughtfully. The days passed, but Alexander couldn't shake the thought of Emily. There was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, her quiet strength despite her struggles, that stayed with him. He found himself replaying their conversation at the diner, wondering how someone who had once sat in the same classrooms as him had ended up facing so many challenges. Alexander's assistant, Laura, noticed his distraction during a meeting. When the discussion wrapped up and everyone filed out, she lingered behind. "Everything okay, Mr. King?" she asked, her tone professional but concerned. Alexander tapped his pen against his desk, staring out the window at the city skyline. "Laura, have you ever felt like you've forgotten something important? Something from your past?" Laura tilted her head, considering the question. "I think everyone feels that way at some point. Why do you ask?" Alexander sighed, setting the pen down. "I ran into someone recently. An old classmate. She reminded me of a time in my life I haven't thought about in years. I can't stop thinking about what happened to her. Laura raised an eyebrow. Do you want me to look into it? No, Alexander said quickly, then softened. I don't want to invade her privacy. I feel like I should do something. Laura studied him for a moment, then nodded. Sometimes the best way to help is simply to ask. If she's important to you, start there. Her words stayed with him. That evening, as Alexander sat in his penthouse apartment, he found himself scrolling through the photos he'd saved of Emily from her social media accounts. One photo caught his eye, a group picture from high school, taken at a class event. There she was, standing near the back, her expression shy but her eyes bright. He was in the photo too, standing in the front row, grinning confidently. It struck him how different their paths had been since that day. And yet, here they were, their lives unexpectedly intersecting once more. At the diner, Emily tried to go about her routine as usual, but the encounter with Alexander lingered in her mind. She hadn't thought about high school in years, let alone the boy who had seemed destined for greatness. Back then, they had lived in completely different worlds. He was the ambitious, outgoing type, always surrounded by people. She was the quiet girl who stayed in the background, sketching in her notebook and dreaming of something more. And now, here he was, walking into her life as if no time had passed. It was strange, almost surreal. She had told herself not to dwell on it, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. During her next shift, as she refilled a customer's coffee, a familiar figure walked through the door. Her heart skipped a beat as Alexander entered the diner, his presence commanding the room even in his casual attire. He spotted her immediately and smiled, making his way to the counter. Back again? Emily asked, trying to keep her tone light. I couldn't resist, Alexander said, taking a seat. I figured I owed you a proper meal after all the trouble I caused last time. Emily raised an eyebrow. You mean saving me from being mugged? Alexander chuckled. Fair point. She grabbed a menu and handed it to him. All right, Mr. King. What'll it be? Surprise me, he said, leaning back slightly. I trust your judgment. Emily smirked, jotting down an order. You're lucky I'm in a good mood. Otherwise, I'd bring you the burnt toast special. He laughed, and for a moment, it felt like they were back in high school, bantering as though no time had passed. But there was something deeper beneath the surface now, a shared understanding, a connection neither of them could quite explain. As she walked away to place his order, Alexander watched her, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know why he kept coming back, why he felt this pull toward her. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore it. After his meal, Alexander waited for Emily to finish her shift. When she finally emerged from the back, still wearing her red blouse and carrying her bag, he stepped forward. Walk with me, he asked. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Sure. They strolled down the quiet street, the city lights casting a warm glow around them. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable but charged with unspoken words. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. Why didn't we ever talk in high school? Emily glanced at him, surprised by the question. You were busy being the golden boy, she said with a small smile. And I wasn't. He frowned. That's not true. You were always drawing. Everyone knew you were talented. She shrugged. Maybe. But talent doesn't mean much when you're invisible. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always been so focused on his own goals, his own ambitions, that he hadn't taken the time to notice the people around him. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for not seeing you back then. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him. You don't have to apologize. We were kids. We've both moved on. Have we? Alexander asked, his voice soft but insistent. Because I don't think it's a coincidence that we ran into each other after all this time. Emily studied him, her expression unreadable. What are you saying? I don't know, he admitted. But I feel like there's more to this. Like I'm supposed to do something. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Do something? What? Save me? Fix my problems? Is that why you're here? No, Alexander said firmly. That's not what I meant. Then what do you mean? She asked, her voice rising slightly. Because I'm not some charity case for you to feel good about helping. Alexander took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Emily, I'm not trying to insult you. I care. That's all. The sincerity in his voice gave her pause. She looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to snap. I'm just not used to people caring. He hesitated, then reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Maybe it's time to let someone? She looked up at him, her expression softening. For the first time, she allowed herself to really see him, not just the millionaire or the boy from high school, but the person standing in front of her, offering his support without asking for anything in return. Okay, she said quietly. But don't expect me to make it easy. Alexander smiled. I wouldn't dream of it. As they continued walking, the tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative sense of understanding. They didn't know where this newfound connection would lead, but for the first time, they both felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. The following weeks brought an unexpected rhythm to Alexander and Emily's lives. Alexander found excuses to visit the diner, becoming a regular in a place that was far removed from his high-powered world. At first, Emily had been skeptical of his intentions. She wasn't used to anyone sticking around, let alone someone like Alexander King, a man who seemed to have the entire world at his fingertips. But as time passed, she began to see a different side of him. He wasn't just the polished millionaire from high school who had seemingly floated through life untouched by struggle. He was thoughtful, curious, and surprisingly down-to-earth. And most importantly, he listened. When she talked about her mother's health, her long shifts, and her dreams of doing something more with her life, he didn't try to fix things or offer solutions. He simply listened. One evening, after closing up the diner, Emily found Alexander waiting for her outside. The air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. She raised an eyebrow as she approached him. Don't you have better places to be? She teased, her tone light. Alexander grinned. Probably. But none of them are as interesting as this. Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. What do you want, Alexander? Dinner, he said simply, holding up a bag from a nearby food truck. You've been feeding me every time I come here. I figured it was my turn. Emily hesitated, her defenses rising instinctively. But the warmth in his eyes and the genuine gesture caught her off guard. Finally, she sighed. Fine. But only because I'm starving. They sat on a bench outside the diner, unwrapping their food and eating in companionable silence. For a while, the only sounds were the occasional honk of a distant car and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was simple, quiet, and oddly comforting. So, Alexander said after a while, if you could do anything, anything at all, what would it be? Emily glanced at him, chewing thoughtfully. You mean besides working double shifts at the diner? He smirked. Yes, besides that. She leaned back, her gaze drifting to the stars. I don't know. I used to think about going back to school. Maybe studying art or design. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an artist. You're still an artist, Alexander said, his tone matter-of-fact. Emily snorted. Sure, if doodling on napkins counts. I'm serious, he said, turning to face her. You're talented, Emily. You always have been. You just haven't had the chance to really explore it. She looked at him, her skepticism softening into something more vulnerable. It's not that simple, Alexander. Between my mom's medical bills and everything else, dreams don't pay the rent. Maybe not, he said. But that doesn't mean you have to give up on them. His words hung in the air, carrying a weight that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Emily looked away, the flicker of hope in her chest quickly overshadowed by the reality of her circumstances. She wanted to believe him, to believe that her dreams were still within reach, but the world had taught her otherwise. Over the next few days, Alexander found himself thinking more and more about Emily's words. He had spent his entire life chasing success, building an empire from the ground up. But what good was all of it if he couldn't use it to make a difference? The idea of helping Emily stirred something in him, not pity, but a genuine desire to see her thrive. One afternoon, he called Laura into his office. I need you to do something for me, he said. She raised an eyebrow. What's that? I want you to find out about art programs, grants, scholarships, anything that could help someone like Emily get back on her feet and pursue her passion. Laura's expression softened, and a small smile tugged at her lips. You really care about her, don't you? Alexander hesitated, then nodded. I do. She deserves a chance. Laura nodded. I'll see what I can find. Meanwhile, Emily was busy juggling her usual responsibilities. Between her shifts at the diner and taking care of her mother, she barely had time to think about herself. But every so often, her mind would wander to Alexander and the strange way he had re-entered her life. She couldn't figure him out. Why would someone like him, someone who could have anything or anyone, care about someone like her? One evening, as she sat at her mother's bedside, her mom stirred and opened her eyes. Emily, she said weakly. I'm here, Mom, Emily said, taking her hand. Her mother's eyes searched hers, a faint smile appearing on her lips. You look happy. Emily blinked, surprised. I do. Her mother nodded. It's been a long time since I've seen that spark in your eyes. Is it because of him? Emily's cheeks flushed. Who? The man you've been talking about, her mother said. The one who keeps showing up at the diner. Emily hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. It's not like that, Mom. He's just a friend. Her mother gave her a knowing look. Sometimes, friends turn into something more. Emily shook her head, laughing softly. You're impossible. Maybe, her mother said, her voice growing faint again. But if he's making you smile, that's something. As her mother drifted back to sleep, Emily sat in the quiet room, her thoughts tangled. She wasn't sure what Alexander meant to her yet, but she couldn't deny that he had brought something into her life she hadn't felt in years: hope. A week later, Alexander showed up at the diner again, this time with a folder in hand. He waited until Emily's shift ended, then motioned for her to join him outside. What's that? She asked, nodding toward the folder. He handed it to her. Just something I thought you might want to look at. Emily opened the folder, her eyes scanning the papers inside. They were applications for art programs, grants, and even a scholarship for a local design school. Her breath caught as she realized what he had done. Alexander, she said, her voice shaking. Why would you? Because I believe in you, he said simply. And because you deserve a chance to chase your dreams. Emily stared at him, her emotions warring between gratitude and frustration. I can't take this, she said, shoving the folder back at him. I don't need your help. Emily, he said gently, this isn't about me trying to save you. It's about you realizing that you're worth investing in. You're talented. You have something special to offer the world. Don't let fear stop you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. You can, he said firmly. And I'll be here to support you every step of the way. For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to hope, really hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. Emily clutched the folder Alexander had handed her, staring at the opportunities inside. Her hands trembled, not just from the weight of what was possible, but from the fear that had always held her back. She had buried her dreams so deeply beneath the struggles of daily life that opening herself up to the possibility of success felt like staring into a vast, unknown abyss. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice breaking the quiet tension between them. Alexander met her gaze steadily, his expression calm but sincere. Because someone once believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And now I want to do the same for you. Emily opened her mouth to argue, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. The walls she had built around herself, the ones that protected her from hope and disappointment, seemed to crack just a little. She looked back down at the papers and took a shaky breath. What if I fail? You won't, Alexander said simply. But even if you stumble, that's okay. Failing isn't the end, it's part of the process. His words settled in her chest like a warm glow. She wanted to believe him, to trust that she was capable of more than just surviving. For so long, she had carried the burden of her struggles alone. But now, for the first time in years, someone was offering her a lifeline. I'll think about it, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, his smile gentle. That's all I'm asking. That night, Emily stayed up late in her tiny apartment, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the folders spread out in front of her. Her mother's soft breathing came from the bedroom, a steady rhythm that was both reassuring and bittersweet. Emily thumbed through the scholarship applications, tracing the bold headlines and imagining what it would feel like to walk into an art classroom again. To sit among people who shared her passion. To create without the crushing weight of her current reality. But with every flicker of hope came doubt. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? What if the sacrifices weren't worth it? She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the couch. Alexander's voice echoed in her mind, "You're worth investing in." The next morning, Emily made a decision. She pulled one of the applications from the folder and began filling it out, her pen moving slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she knew she couldn't let fear stop her from trying. When Emily told Alexander she had started the application process, his reaction was understated but filled with quiet pride. "I knew you could do it," he said, his smile soft and genuine. Emily rolled her eyes, though there was a faint blush on her cheeks. "Don't act like this is some big victory for you. I'm doing this for me, not for you. I wouldn't have it any other way," Alexander said, his tone light but his words carrying weight. Their dynamic began to shift after that. Emily found herself looking forward to Alexander's visits to the diner, though she would never admit it out loud. He became a fixture in her life, his presence steady and dependable in a way she hadn't expected. And Alexander, for his part, found himself drawn not just to Emily's strength but to the way she challenged him to see the world differently. One evening, as they sat together at the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily turned to him with a curious expression. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Tell you what?" Alexander asked, tilting his head. "That you remembered me from high school," she said. "You recognized me the night we met, didn't you?" Alexander hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I did," he admitted. "But I wasn't sure if you'd want to remember me." Emily frowned. "Why wouldn't I?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I wasn't exactly the kind of guy who paid attention to people back then. I was so focused on my own ambitions that I didn't stop to notice anyone else. I figured you might not have the best opinion of me." Emily studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "You're not who you were back then. People change." Her words surprised him, filling him with a strange sense of relief. "And what about you?" he asked. "Do you think you've changed?" Emily laughed softly. "I've had to. Life doesn't really give you a choice." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from two people who understand each other on a level deeper than words. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew that something more was beginning to bloom. Weeks turned into months, and Emily's world began to shift in ways she hadn't thought possible. She was accepted into a local art program on a partial scholarship, and Alexander, true to his word, supported her every step of the way. He helped her balance her schedule, encouraged her when she doubted herself, and even sat through a few of her art critiques, his presence a comforting anchor in the chaotic whirlwind of her new life. But Emily wasn't the only one who was changing. Alexander, too, found himself reevaluating his priorities. The relentless pursuit of wealth and success that had once consumed him no longer felt as fulfilling. Spending time with Emily had reminded him of the importance of connection, of the simple joys that couldn't be measured in dollars or deals. One evening, after attending one of Emily's art showcases, Alexander pulled her aside. The gallery was buzzing with activity, people admiring the vibrant, emotional pieces Emily had created. But all Alexander could see was her bright eyes, her confident smile, the way she seemed to light up the room. "Emily," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to tell you something." She turned to him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "You've changed my life. Being around you, it's made me realize how much I've been missing. And not just with my work or my goals, but with everything. You've reminded me of what it means to feel alive." Emily blinked, caught off guard by his vulnerability. "Alexander, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear right now," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. But I care about you. More than I ever thought I could. For a moment, Emily didn't know how to respond. Her heart raced, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, afraid of letting anyone get too close. But Alexander had broken through those walls, not with grand gestures or promises, but with his quiet support and unwavering belief in her. I care about you too, she said finally, her voice soft but honest. But this, it scares me. I know, Alexander said gently. It scares me too. But I'm not going anywhere, Emily. Not unless you tell me to. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was the man who had been there for her, who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to trust. You're impossible, she said with a small smile. Alexander grinned. I've been told that before. As they stood there, surrounded by the hum of the gallery, they both knew that this was just the beginning. Their lives had taken them on different paths, but somehow, those paths had led them back to each other. And though the future was uncertain, they were ready to face it, together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Emily. The art program she had dreamed of attending was more challenging than she had anticipated, but it also felt like the missing piece of her life was finally falling into place. Every class, every brushstroke, reminded her of the girl she used to be, the one who sketched in notebooks during high school, full of ideas but too scared to believe they could ever amount to anything. But things were different now. She had Alexander. He was there for every milestone, showing up at her showcases, encouraging her when she felt overwhelmed, and even helping her brainstorm ideas for her projects. At first, she had been wary of his involvement. She wasn't used to leaning on anyone. But over time, she began to realize that his support wasn't a way of taking over her life, it was his way of being part of it. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Emily returned to her apartment to find Alexander waiting for her at the door. He held a bouquet of sunflowers, their bright yellow petals standing out against the dim hallway. What's this? Emily asked, smiling despite her exhaustion. Alexander shrugged, a playful grin on his face. Just thought you could use a little sunshine after today. She laughed, taking the flowers from him. You're ridiculous. Maybe, he said, following her inside. But I'm also right. You look like you've been through a war. Emily placed the flowers in a glass jar, filling it with water from the sink. It was just a long day. Critique sessions can be brutal. Did they say anything helpful? Alexander asked, leaning against the counter. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Mostly. But sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough. Alexander straightened, his expression serious. Emily, you're more than enough. And your work is incredible. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. His words settled over her like a warm blanket, soothing the doubts that had been gnawing at her all day. She turned to him, her eyes soft. You're too good at this, you know. At what? He asked, feigning innocence. Being too, she said with a small laugh. Saying exactly what I need to hear. He smiled, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Maybe it's because I mean it. As Emily's confidence in her art grew, so did her relationship with Alexander. It wasn't something they talked about openly, but the bond between them deepened with every shared moment. He became a fixture in her life, someone she could count on no matter what. And slowly, Emily began to let go of the walls she had built around her heart. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park together, Alexander glanced at her with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd stayed in touch after high school? Emily tilted her head, considering the question. Honestly, I don't think we would have gotten along back then. Really? Alexander asked, raising an eyebrow. Why not? She smiled, a teasing glint in her eyes. You were a little intense. Always chasing some big goal. I don't think you would have had time for someone like me. Alexander chuckled, though her words gave him pause. You might be right. I was pretty focused. But maybe that's why it worked out this way. We found each other when we were supposed to. Emily looked at him, her smile softening. You're surprisingly philosophical for a businessman. Don't let it fool you, he said, grinning. I still have spreadsheets for everything. She laughed, the sound light and genuine. It amazed her how easily he could make her feel at ease, even when she was dealing with the stress of school and her mother's health. He had become her anchor in a way she hadn't expected, and she wasn't sure she could imagine her life without him. But not everything in Emily's life was as steady as her relationship with Alexander. Her mother's health had been declining slowly but noticeably, and the weight of it pressed heavily on Emily's shoulders. One evening, as she sat by her mother's bedside, the older woman reached out and took her hand. "Emily," her mother said softly, her voice frail but steady. "You've been doing so much. Taking care of me, going to school, building your life. I'm so proud of you." Tears pricked at Emily's eyes. "Mom, don't say it like that. You're going to be okay." Her mother gave her a weak smile. "I know you don't like to talk about it, but we both know what's coming. And that's okay. I've had a good life. My only regret is that I won't get to see everything you're going to accomplish." Emily shook her head, her tears spilling over. "Don't say that. You'll be here. You'll see it all." Her mother squeezed her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You've always been my fighter, Emily. But it's okay to let go. To live for yourself. Promise me you'll keep going, no matter what?" Emily nodded, though the words felt like a lump in her throat. "I promise." A week later, Emily's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. The loss hit Emily like a tidal wave, leaving her feeling untethered and raw. Alexander was by her side through it all, offering his quiet strength and unwavering support. He handled the details she couldn't bear to think about, from arranging the funeral to making sure she ate and rested. The funeral was a small, intimate gathering, attended by a handful of people who had known her mother over the years. Emily stood by the graveside, clutching a single sunflower as tears streamed down her face. Alexander stood beside her, his presence a steadying force. After the service, as the crowd began to disperse, Emily turned to Alexander. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do it alone," he said gently. "Not anymore." She nodded, her tears falling freely. And for the first time, she allowed herself to lean on him completely, letting his arms wrap around her as she sobbed into his shoulder. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and healing. Emily threw herself into her art, channeling her emotions into her work. Her professors noticed a shift in her pieces, the raw emotion that now infused every stroke and color. Her classmates, too, were drawn to her work, marveling at the way she captured the complexity of human emotion. Alexander continued to be her rock, showing up to every showcase and reminding her that she was stronger than she realized. But as their bond deepened, so did the unspoken feelings between them. It was clear to anyone who saw them together that they were more than just friends, but neither of them seemed ready to say the words out loud. One evening, after attending one of Emily's most successful showcases yet, they found themselves sitting on the rooftop of her apartment building. The city lights stretched out before them, a glittering sea of possibilities. "You did amazing tonight," Alexander said, his voice soft. "Your work, it's incredible, Emily." She smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's because of you, you know. I wouldn't be here without you." "That's not true," he said. "You've always had this in you. I just gave you a little nudge." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Why do you do it? Why do you care so much?" He hesitated, his heart pounding. "Because you matter to me, Emily. More than anything." Her breath caught, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent so long convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she could handle everything on her own. But Alexander had shown her that leaning on someone didn't make her weak, it made her stronger. "I care about you too," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Slowly, Alexander reached out, his hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers with his, a silent promise of what was to come. And as they sat together under the stars, their lives intertwined in ways they never could have imagined, both of them knew that this was only the beginning of their story. The rooftop became their refuge over the next few weeks. It was a quiet space above the noise of the city where Emily and Alexander could talk without the weight of the world pressing on them. Their late-night conversations ranged from light-hearted banter about their high school days to deeper topics, like the struggles they had faced and the paths that had led them back to each other. One night, as the cool breeze carried the faint hum of traffic from below, Alexander looked over at Emily. She was leaning against the railing, her hair tousled by the wind, a faint smile on her lips. He marveled at how much she had changed since they'd reconnected, not just in her confidence, but in the way she carried herself. She no longer seemed weighed down by life's burdens. Instead, there was a spark in her that hadn't been there before. "You know," Alexander said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've never met anyone like you." Emily turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" He chuckled. "It's a very good thing. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Emily. And I don't just mean because of everything you've been through. It's the way you keep going no matter what. You inspire me." Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. She had always seen Alexander as the one with all the power and resources, the one who had it all figured out. To hear him say that she inspired him felt surreal. "I think you give me too much credit," she said softly, looking away. "Not at all," he said. "You've changed me, Emily. Before I met you again, my life was all about work, success, making more money. But you've reminded me that there's so much more to life than that. You've shown me what really matters." Her heart swelled at his words, but a flicker of doubt crept in. She turned back to him, her gaze steady. "What happens when you get tired of this? Of me?" Alexander frowned, his expression serious. "Emily, that's not going to happen. You don't know that," she said, her voice trembling. "You come from a completely different world, Alexander. What if one day you wake up and realize this was all just a distraction?" He stepped closer, his hands resting gently on her arms. "This isn't a distraction. You're not a distraction. You're the most real thing in my life, Emily. And I'm not going anywhere." The raw emotion in his voice broke through her defenses, and she nodded, her tears glistening in the moonlight. "Okay," she whispered. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if to prove his words. And in that moment, with the city stretching out beneath them, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. As their relationship deepened, Emily's life continued to transform. Her art began gaining recognition beyond her program, with local galleries expressing interest in showcasing her work. She threw herself into her projects, pouring her heart and soul into every piece. And through it all, Alexander was by her side, cheering her on every step of the way. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through a small art fair, Emily stopped in front of a booth displaying handmade jewelry. A delicate silver necklace with a sunflower pendant caught her eye, and she reached out to touch it. "Do you like it?" Alexander asked, noticing the way her fingers lingered on the pendant. She nodded. "It reminds me of my mom. She loved sunflowers." Without a word, Alexander signaled to the vendor and purchased the necklace. He turned to Emily, fastening it around her neck before she could protest. "There," he said, stepping back to admire it. "It suits you." Emily's hand went to the pendant, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you. It's just a small thing," he said with a smile. "But I wanted you to have something that reminds you of her." Emily felt her chest tighten, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You're always doing that," she said softly. "Doing what?" "Making me feel seen," she said. "Like I matter." "You do matter," he said simply. "More than you know." Despite the joy and progress in her life, Emily still wrestled with moments of doubt. One afternoon, as she prepared for a major art exhibit that would feature her work, she found herself pacing her studio, her nerves fraying. She couldn't stop thinking about the what-ifs. What if no one liked her pieces? What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? Alexander arrived to find her sitting on the floor, her back against the wall and her head in her hands. He crouched down beside her, concern etched on his face. "Hey," he said gently. "What's going on?" "I can't do this," she said, her voice muffled. "What if it's a disaster?" "It won't be," he said firmly. "Your work is incredible, Emily. You've put everything into this, and people are going to see that." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But what if they don't? What if I've been fooling myself this whole time? Alexander reached out, taking her hands in his. You're not fooling anyone. You've worked so hard to get here, and you've earned this moment. Don't let fear take that away from you. His words, as always, steadied her. She took a deep breath, nodding slowly. She said, I'll try. That's all you need to do, he said, smiling. Just show up and let the world see what I already know. You're amazing. The exhibit was a resounding success. Emily's pieces drew crowds, with visitors praising the raw emotion and vibrant energy in her work. Several pieces sold within the first hour, and a gallery owner approached her about representing her in future exhibits. As she stood in the middle of the bustling gallery, her cheeks flushed with pride, Alexander approached her with a glass of champagne. To the star of the evening, he said, raising his glass. Emily laughed, clinking her glass against his. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have, he said. But I'm glad I got to be part of it. They stood together, watching as people admired her work, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months passed, and Emily's career continued to flourish. She secured a permanent spot in a prominent gallery, and her pieces began attracting attention from collectors outside the city. Her life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined, and through it all, Alexander remained her constant. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's heart skipped a beat as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Emily, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, you've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. You've shown me what it means to love, to hope, and to truly live. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Will you marry me? Tears filled Emily's eyes as she looked at him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course, yes. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly, and pulled her into his arms. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other tightly as the world seemed to fade away. In that moment, everything felt perfect. Their journey hadn't been easy, and they both knew there would be challenges ahead. But they also knew that they were stronger together, and that their love had been worth every struggle, every doubt, and every twist of fate that had brought them back to each other. As they sat together, dreaming of the future, Emily thought about how far she had come, from the girl drawing in notebooks at the back of the classroom to the woman standing beside the man she loved, ready to build a life together. And for the first time, she truly believed in the power of second chances.